You're listening to Faith Community Church's weekly podcast. We hope this week's message from God is insightful and an inspiration to you.
My name's Adam Nye. My family and I, we just moved. Normally when I preach from an iPad, and I don't even know where my iPad is. So I printed my sermon on paper this morning. If you've moved, you know what I'm talking about. I want to take us all back 20 years to 2005. I was 3 years into what would become a long career of teaching high school students the Bible. It's what I do now. I was 27 at the time. Stop that head math. Doesn't matter what I am today. I was 27 then. And my school, Monte Vista Christian, which I was also an alumnus of, go Mustangs. They were introducing that year a program where us teachers were encouraged to design educational trips so we could take students anywhere around the world. And with my wife, Rachel's help, we jumped at the chance to take students to Greece. I think we wanted Italy, but it was already spoken for. So we went to Greece. And as a high school Bible teacher, I was excited about the idea of going to Greece. I had never been to Europe at all. And what I knew about Greece as I'm teaching the Bible is when I'm going through the Bible, it is such a consistent theme that God is trying to get his people to resist the temptation of idolatry, which is something as I'm teaching through it, I'm like, I don't know how to relate to this temptation. I don't know how to get inside the headspace of a culture compelled to make statues and temples to this pantheon of gods. So I was like, maybe going there, kind of just being in the streets that are, created around that worldview would be of some help. So it was. Day one, we took these students to Athens, up on the Acropolis. You guys recognize the Acropolis of Athens? It was pretty cool. It was a cool experience. And you could see how, just like when we would be in the Plaka, the market down at the bottom of the hill, the temples on the Acropolis, don't go forward yet, that's a different picture. The temples at the top of the Acropolis would loom, and you'd be like, yeah, okay, I can kind of see if all of your daily life is lived under the shadow of those temples. I guess I could kind of see joining in that way of looking at the world with all of these various gods and these statues. But then we went to Corinth. Now go to the other picture. This is Corinth. And the Acropolis, which just kind of means a hill or a mountain in the city, is way bigger in Corinth than it is in Athens. And from that perspective, I'm like, oh, I think I kind of feel it. I think I kind of understand where this comes from. And in retrospect, I'm like, I can also kind of see why in Athens, yeah, there's a hill up there and there's temples up there, but I also kind of see that was the place where questioning of polytheism in favor of monotheism from within pagan culture had started. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they had all lived in Athens, and they were questioning the gods. When I was in Corinth, I was like, okay, with a looming mountain, which casts its shadow over you all the time, I immediately could kind of, at least I thought I could, relate to these ancient people who lived under the shadow of lots of things they can't control, right? You're living out your life. You're trying to feed your family. You're trying to make sure your crops are growing. You depend on the sunshine and the rain and the fertility of your crops and keeping invading armies at bay, and you can't necessarily control any of those things. So the suggestion that someone lived up on the top of that mountain that you could do some business with and get them on your side, and that could put some of those uncontrolled things under control. It's like, yeah, I think maybe I understand that a little bit at least. So today's passage is, as Andy said, put your finger in Exodus chapter 34. Look at verse 17. It says this, do not make any idols. That's the whole passage. Andy's like, Adam, preach a sermon. I got a passage for you to preach. It's real meaty. You'll be able to unpack a lot of it. That's the whole thing. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, maybe in context. No, look in the context. If you back up a verse, it's talking about being careful who you marry. If you go forward a verse, it moves on to like the festival of unleavened bread. This is this one statement, don't make idols. Bam. That is our passage for this morning. But I do think this is something we could talk about quite a bit. And given the fact that I'm moving, or we just recently moved, I'm going to go ahead and credit where a lot of what is about to come comes from. Tim Keller's book, Every Great Endeavor. It's been kind of guiding a lot of our sermons in this Life on Purpose series. But he's going to help us sort of define what idolatry is and thinking about how it might impact the way we live our lives, particularly our work lives. So let me make a couple attempts at defining idolatry biblically. We could put it as something like this: putting ultimate trust in something other than God. If we look outside of Exodus 34:17, back up several chapters to the Ten Commandments, the first two of the Ten Commandments are related to this, right? The second commandment says, is really the idolatry commandment. It says, do not make for yourself a graven image. That commandment, again, is the one I struggled with as a young teacher of the Bible. It's like, what was the compulsion to make statues? Like, it was something that God seemed to have to wrestle out of the Israelites so often. Like, if they weren't constantly fighting against the temptation, they would just start whittling a block of wood and making a statue and putting it on their shelf and worshiping it. I was like, I don't understand that compulsion. But I think when you sort of probe the ancient mind in the ways it parallels our modern mind, you can start to see some of the instincts for it. We just express those instincts differently. I think the instinct is something like feeling, getting a little overly nervous and anxious when we're dealing with things we can't see and control. And God is calling his people to have a relationship with him that lacks both of those qualities. I'm not directly observable, and you can't control me, so don't try by making something that you can see and hold, right, and manipulate. That's that second commandment. And we should note that those are the basic elements of our modern scientific method: observation and control, right? We have a similar instinct. We might not express it in that way. And I certainly don't want to say that, like, God forbids science. I want to say ultimately that God quite encourages us to have a scientific mindset toward the observable world, but just to keep that out of our relationship to him, right? We should have self-control, and we should be vigorously resisting superstition in our ways of thinking about him. But we need to remember that you can't apply the means of scientific method to God, observation and control. But really above, and what I think drives the second commandment is the first commandment. You shall have no gods before me, right? Ultimately, the temptation to worship an idol is a temptation to put our trust, our ultimate value, our hope, meaning, something, rather than directly in God, who is beyond our observation and control, to put it in something else. Only God himself has complete knowledge, observes, and controls all things. So he says, so put your trust, ultimate hope, meaning, value, put it in me. That's the first commandment. Martin Luther made a point that you really never sin. You never break any other commandment without first breaking the first commandment, right? The compulsion to break any other command, to sin in any way, starts with the allowance of something to matter more to us than God. So that's idolatry. We can acknowledge that the committing idolatry is a bit more explicit in the ancient world, and in that way, I think it might be like not easier to deal with, but maybe in the fact that the ancient cultures, the people God was calling his people out from, practiced explicit idolatry. They had gods that they named, made statues and temples to, and worshiped them. In our day, we don't quite practice idolatry in that way, but we certainly break that first commandment. We are certainly tempted and guilty of putting other things in front of God. And I think maybe the more subtle and implicit ways we are tempted toward idolatry makes it more dangerous and difficult to rid ourselves of. So maybe another way to put it would be idolatry is taking a good thing and making it the ultimate thing. This is the temptation that is constantly in front of us. Taking something that is good or something that would be good, that God has given to us as a good thing, right? Oftentimes there are things in our lives that if we received them with gratitude to God, they could be great blessings in our lives. But the moment we take them from God and put our ultimate meaning and value not in the giver but in the gift, it becomes a god. It becomes a master. And when we serve good things as ultimate things, at best, they become disappointing in the rewards they give for our service. But at worst, and I want to say ultimately, inevitably, they become cruel, tyrannical masters. Right? When we serve something lower than God, when we serve the creation rather than the creator, that lower God will become to us demonic. It will become a power that robs us of life and joy. And that's nowhere more clear than in our work lives. So today, we're going to talk about the way that work reveals our idols. And here, to be clear, I know Andy and Jamie and Brian and others that have preached before me have been clear that when we talk about work, we're not just necessarily talking about something we spend time doing in exchange for money. This can be within the work we do in our homes, the volunteer work we do in our communities, whatever plow we put our hands to will often show out where we've put our ultimate meaning, value, and hope. The way we work, maybe the hours we work, maybe how our face looks when we work, maybe our ability to rest from work. These are ways in which we will be able to see the true God we serve. All these ways may be signs of where we put our ultimate meaning, value, and hope. Now, the way idolatry can play out in our work lives can operate both at an individual and like corporate or like cultural level. And I think mostly in this series so far, we've been dealing with like the individual level. Like, what are the things I have allowed to become too important to me? But I think we need to recognize that idolatry is more often a cultural reality. It is something that permeates like a group of people. And that could just be a family. It could be your particular workplace. It can be a country or a continent. It can be a sort of a movement within a particular time and place. But it's when idolatry is like working in the air you're breathing and you're not even aware of it. When it's just a part of the assumptions we all make, whoever that we is. When you fear immediate ostracization, pretty sure that's a word. When you feel immediate marginalization, let's say, for doing or not doing something, for saying or not saying something. When everyone's face immediately contorts in fear or rage at certain suggestions. you might be up against a kind of cultural idol. I would say idolatry is the most devastating and the most difficult to avoid when it takes hold within a cultural setting. And you can insert whatever major historical tragedy or atrocity, right? If you think about how did those people let themselves get to that place where they were willing to participate in that? Some kind of idolatry, some kind of good virtue that got too far inflated is probably behind that. Culture, though, is not singular. It's not monolithic. Our culture, especially, I would say, is the product of various dynamic forces sort of pushing and pulling against each other. And Keller identifies three of those as kind of one way of understanding our modern American society being like traditional culture, modern culture, and postmodern culture, each of which has certain virtues it upholds, and therefore temptations to turn those virtues into idols. So let's start with traditional culture. This is any culture where things like loyalty, duty, social stability, where these things are very highly prized, maybe prized above maybe anything else. And obviously on their own, I think all of these things are good things. Hopefully we all recognize that none of these are vices in and of themselves, they're virtues. But when they become the highest thing, when they become gods, the result can be a stifling rigidity, a silencing of critique, and a tyranny of the status quo. This is something you may or may not have experienced in your work life. I would say on a certain level, I have. There was a time in my life after the 2005 thing I told you about, when I was a high school teacher in my 20s, I saw that as a temporary stop on my career journey. And a little bit later, I worked at a church full time, and it was a church that I think would really prize itself on not being stuck in these sort of traditional sort of forms. But from the inside, it did start to become very clear to me how dangerous it was to question certain stories we told about ourselves within that church community in ways that were immediately ostracizing. And then I immediately felt the pressure not to say those kinds of things, to sort of conform to the stability that this place was granting us, to be loyal and do my duty within that space. Within the culture we live in, this is a reality that plays itself out, though it is itself, I think, quite often under critique, right? I would say every movie I grew up in was set against this kind of background, and the hero was the bold soul that broke their way out, right? So there we can start to talk about another sort of culture within our culture that pushes and pulls against this traditionalism, which is modernism. Modernism, when we use that phrase, we're referencing a development that begins in the Enlightenment. And really, you could even point back earlier to the Reformation and the Renaissance. If you're not into history, you're like, what are you talking about? Well, you might at least know that Martin Luther, who I referenced before, among others in the 1500s, was questioning how the dominant traditionalism they were living in was actually at odds with the earlier, deeper tradition of the Christian faith. They were critiquing their tradition by the Bible itself and the early church tradition. And that created this groundswell within certain places in Europe so that you began to have these clashing traditionalisms. And that turned into war, like decades and decades long wars throughout Europe. It's like, who were you going to be loyalty to? What social stability would take hold within Europe? So after like 100 years of that, in the 1600s, a new way of thinking started to emerge That's like maybe this, unflinching adherence to tradition is the problem. Maybe we need a new paradigm. So you had, rather than loyalty, duty, social stability being prized, you had things like reason and science start to become more important alongside individualism. Because rather than just the group going along in groupthink, through reason and science, the individual can sort of discern reality without needing to, buy into whatever some authority figure says. And then, rather than the virtue of duty that leads to like an ongoing social stability being highly prized, the individual's individual achievement becomes the greater virtue. Not how are you playing your part with, as a cog in a machine, but how are you standing out from the crowd? Using these resources the Enlightenment has given us. So, and it has to be acknowledged, I don't know how many of us would struggle to acknowledge, that the Enlightenment did produce some positive results. It was not entirely negative. The great scientific and technological innovations we take for granted today largely grow out of this history. Greater efficiency, greater general societal wealth has certainly emerged from it. But as these things became a new kind of religion, and they unquestionably did, as these went from just being virtues to being gods, you have the resulting, as I said, when these things become gods, they become cruel masters. And so you have the results of this kind of religion being overwork, and burnout. The ruining of creation, right? When all that kind of matters is this technological advancement and individual achievement, all of God's creation just becomes resources to consume. And so you end up, destroying the planet and breaking community, right? Because it's this overreaction from the social stability of modernism to like, I must advance my career and it doesn't matter where I need to go and who I need to leave in order to make that happen. I would say within my own personal work life, I had some experience of this myself as well. On the other side of my sojourn, trying to be a pastor in a church and realizing that's not really going to work for me. That doesn't really fit my, at least at the time, it seemed pretty clear, it doesn't really fit my DNA. I had come into the church world from, a PhD. And when I did a PhD, I was like, I need to sort of, I need to chase down some ideas. I need to find some ways of like thinking about God and the world and the gospel that I'm not really receiving within my church life. And that was what kind of drove me. I didn't really have careerism in mind when I did a PhD, which ultimately is not wise. If you're not going to do a PhD for the purpose of a career, you probably shouldn't do it, but that's its own sermon. On realizing this church thing was not really going to work out for me, I was like, maybe I do need to take a real stab at academic life and see if I can, get full-time teaching work at the college level or the grad school level. And one of the reasons I had avoided that was because I knew how competitive it was. But I kind of got to a point in my life where I really didn't see any other way forward. It was kind of full-time academia or bust. And I took the bait of that fear, hook, line, and sinker. My life just became about trying to get my resume to look like these colleges needed me, right? I was going to conferences all the time, trying to write things, get them published. The overwork thing, the anxiety of just constantly feeling like you're falling behind, the imposter syndrome of just like, I'm trying to, on paper, look like I stand out, but I don't think I'll ever really catch up. Yeah, it was crippling. You could probably relate. Well, then society, though, also, is not just a tug of war between traditionalism and modernism. There were sort of cultural prophets lurking in the shadows throughout the modern project of the 1600s, 1700s, And then as modernism really got to its highest insanity in the 1800s, if you look, it's worth an internet search to look at some of the newspaper headlines of the 1800s that were just prophesying this absolute scientific and technological utopia that the world was on the brink of. Every disease would be cured, all wars would be ended, global hunger would be eradicated, science and technology were going to provide this. And some smarter voices said, this is not going to end well. You had people who were in their own way a kind of modernist, like Friedrich Nietzsche, pointing out that this was becoming its own kind of absurd religion, right? That modernism had begun as the antidote to religion, but it was taking on all the worst things it was critiquing about religion. And then as you got into the first part of the 20th century, those prophecies were quite loudly fulfilled, right? There were two major global world wars in the first half of the 20th century, which showed that this the development of science and technology was not necessarily always advancement. It was not always progress, the way the modern world had talked about it. So you have the development of, again, a new way of thinking that we often call postmodernism. And this just looked askance at anyone trying to tell you a story about the world that made it all make sense. That ultimately, the postmodern mindset was not so much as a belief system, but an attitude of cynicism toward all these grand stories that made sense of the universe. There was no ultimate meaning, the postmodernists told us, including progress. No external basis giving meaning to human existence, whether that was loyalty to a group as in modernism or a sense of individual achievement within loyalty to a group within traditionalism or individual achievement. In modernism, both of them were just false narratives that were given to you to make you feel better for this deep sense you had of anxiety that there was really no meaning to life. Postmodernism tried to just embrace the meaninglessness of it all. There's no ultimate reality. There's just kind of what you make of it. So, postmodernism is the embrace of creativity. No one's making the world make any sense for you, so you make it make whatever sense you want to make out of it. Authenticity. You be you. You don't need to play by anybody else's rules. Be yourself. Personal fulfillment. Not individual achievement, because that still has a kind of universal rubric we could use to measure whether someone has achieved something. This was replace that with your own sense of what makes you you, what makes you happy. Follow your own path. That was postmodernism's script. And the result of that, especially for those of us that are more attached to the other cultural foundations, the results of that are not difficult to predict. Just total meaninglessness. A loss of a shared narrative. Sound familiar? And then what I mean by pandemonium here is the idea that, like when Jesus said, you drive out one demon and it wanders around in arid places, and then it comes back to the host it had left, finds it empty, and invites 7 of its friends. In this sense, I think this absence of any kind of agreed upon structure of society has led to a situation where all of the worst aspects of traditionalism and modernism come roaring back in their most dangerous and toxic forms. And I think that's the situation we're in, where you have posing traditionalists and posing modernists who don't even believe what they're selling you, fight to the death, just in this perpetual quest for their own authenticity or something. This is something I've seen in my professional life, especially over the last 5 years as a high school teacher. This is kind of the landscape I see a lot of my students inhabiting. They're desperate for some kind of sense of family inclusion like a traditionalism, and for a sense of wanting to hold on to this idea of progress, that tomorrow might be better than today. But there's just no floor beneath them. There's just this sense of free fall. So the outcome of all this is a sense of despair. Again, on a certain level, we can all relate to that, though maybe not all of us inhabit the world of despair to the same degree as the full-blown postmodernists. But the reality of behind all this, the reason we look at these various types of idolatries is because this is what we have to identify and resist as Christians. We have to remind ourselves that the gospel tells us a better story. When we see the world from the perspective not ultimately of just a stable traditionalism, because the traditionalism itself doesn't really have a larger story other than the status quo. And the gospel as a story other than modernism, the myth of progress, the idea that it is our human efforts that are building this ultimate utopia as the future. When we look at the world from what God has done and is doing through his word and his spirit, we have a better story that grounds our work in a surer foundation. We can see that from the gospel, from the perspective of the gospel, our work becomes a participation in God's work, right? It's not just an advancement of my own tribe, nor is it building the ultimate utopia. God goes ahead of us. God is at work. In our work, it gets gathered into that story. We can see our work as motivated by our identity, not the foundation of it. Again, that's a theme we've been hearing through this series that I think is really healthy. We have to remind ourselves of. Our work becomes something we can find satisfaction in, not ultimate meaning, but real, if contingent is maybe the right word, satisfaction in. But it's also something we can rest from, right? When we see our work as within God's larger story. And ultimately, we can see our work as worship. Speaking of which, I'd like to invite the band back up. So I want to say, recognizing these various cultural idols, being aware of them requires that we resist them. And resistance as Christians means spiritual disciplines, which has to mean more than weekly attendance of church. It has to mean something that works its way into our daily rhythms of life. Traditionalism, modernism, postmodernism, they each tell a story about reality, and those stories hold up their own heroes, whether loyalty to tribe or competitive achievement or personal authenticity. They hold up those heroes as ultimate goods, idols. Our culture is constantly pressing those stories into our hearts. Our participation in the world we're living in, we are imbibing those myths. And therefore, even though that's not statues and temples, those idols are still being held up in front of our eyes. We have to push back. We have to not just have Bibles, but live within them. Let its story and its hero, Jesus, captivate our every thought. It's his work that gives our work its meaning. His work is making us God's children, not cogs in a machine, nor heroes in our own story. And for that reality to really motivate our actions in this world and in our work, it is something we have to just actively cultivate in our hearts, a sense that we are living in that story, in that world. My own experience along those lines was really a liberation from that fight to rise above, the sense of feeling stuck. I had gone from being a high school teacher in my 20s to, going into academia, trying to merge that with church life, and that didn't work. So I tried to go back into full-time academia. And while I was trying to make that work, I went back into teaching high school, which was a very humbling moment in my life. It really did feel like I was taking a step backwards. I was now in my 40s and doing again what I had been doing in my 20s. And the sense of struggle I had with that revealed to me my sort of individual achievement idol I was serving. And I had to bring that to the cross. I had to sort of see, I had to see my story in a different way. I had to let God kind of catch up with me, show me these idols, and show me that like the place he had put me that I was not looking for, that I saw as a step backwards, was actually really a place where God was able to use my gifts to advance his kingdom, to participate in his work. And the discovery of that, which I'll be honest, it took the sort of 2020 shutdown. God had to sort of lock me. I don't want to make it sound like God did this whole COVID thing just for my sake. No, but what he did for me by locking me in my house and just within my neighborhood and taking walks every day with my life was to just open my eyes to, whoa, I have been serving some cruel masters. And God was inviting me into his gentle, loving arms to just continue doing the service I was already doing, but to see it within the story he was telling in my life. So I needed to put Jesus back at the center. I needed to read my Bible. I needed to worship, and I needed to pray. Father, I thank you for your story. I thank you that while the world holds up to us its stories, it holds up to us promising and tempting gods, little g, to worship. You have called us to yourself, sometimes uncomfortably, ripping those idols out of our hands, but way more often, gently and patiently calling us to lay those down and serve you above all things. And I pray that we would recognize the reality that we are your children as having far more ability to give our lives meaning than any other sense of work or duty or achievement we might pursue. By your Spirit, Father, press that reality into our souls this morning. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this production of Faith Community Church in Santa Cruz, California. To visit our complete archive of sermons, to learn more about FCC, or to view our live streaming services, please visit us online at santacruzfaith.org.